Very welcome to today's talk with Nicole Krauss. And this is a seminar that is organized together with Jewish Culture in Sweden and your publisher, Brombergs. And we're so happy to have you here, Nicole. And we might start with just saying something about your books. I mean, you were a poet before you started writing novels, weren't you?
I was. I wanted to be a poet. Yeah. And I think if you would have told me when I was younger that I would have ended up as a novelist, I would have thought that it was an absolute fall from grace.
And do you still regard it as a fall from grace?
A happy one. If it was a fall from, it was a happy one because I'm much more comfortable writing novels. I think part of the move had to do with the fact that I came to feel that a poem really feels it has a capacity to be perfect, and that was just too overwhelming a thing to attempt to do every time. And a novel is almost by definition imperfect. If you think about it, it's partly because as a form, it's so poorly defined. So most we can say about a novel, it's a very long story with a beginning and an end. And yet at the same time, that invites the novelist every time to reinvent the form. And it will always be imperfect. It's more, if in Italian stanza, of course, means room. So if you think of the poem as a kind of room that can be perfect, a novel is more like a house. And there's always like a broken window and the garage door doesn't work and the roof is dripping, but you can live in it, you know? And I like that.
And you can people it. You can fill it with people.
This also as well, yes.
You've written 4 novels so far, and the first one was A Man Walks Into a Room. They are all translated into Swedish, aren't they?
I think so.
I'm quite sure they are. I've only ever read them in English, but and then there's A History of Love and Great House, and now this last one, the latest one, is Forest Dark. Why don't we say something about the title? I mean, perhaps most English-speaking people will recognize this. When you sort of swip the order of the word, they will recognize it as Dante, as when you get lost in a forest dark.
Yes. I don't know how it works in translation, because of course with the sort of Roman languages, like in French and Italian, it's Salve Oscura is the original, Italian. But in English, most people would understand the reference, I hope. But the title was like one of the last things that arrived for this novel, and for a long time I couldn't think of one phrase under which the rest of this world could live. And then at some point I suddenly just remembered that line from Dante midway through the journey of my life. I found myself in the forest dark for the straightforward pathway.
I'll just say it in Swedish.
Yeah.
Mitten av min levnadsbana befann jag mig I en mörk skog. And Mörk skog is the title of the...
Yeah, and the book, of course, was already populated with forests, and also the forest as an idea. So if we think about our kind of cultural imagination of the forest, it is the place where we have gone to get lost, and where dark things can happen, where mystery lives. It is a place outside of the law, of course, and it is opposite to the city, which is sort of a reflection of human ideas and human order. And this book is very much about the characters who allow themselves to get lost, to get off that straight path and begin to circle.
Let's say something about the 2 main characters, because I'm not sure everybody in this room has read the book.
Yeah, of course.
So you have this Julius Epstein, who is an elderly gentleman, and that's a story. His story is told in the third person, whereas the other story is about a writer approaching 40, and she shares her first name with you, Nicole.
Yes.
And she has 2 sons, and she has just been divorced, and she's the first person teller.
She hasn't been divorced.
No, she's not divorced.
No,
that's
but
true.
she's thinking about this enormous change in her life.
Yeah.
I think that's a significant thing because the book is very much about characters, Epstein or Epstein, depending on where you are in the world, what you call him, and Nicole are both characters who have come to that moment in their lives when they feel that, in a sense, the narrative that they have been telling themselves about who they are and the forms that they have chosen for their lives. In the case of Nicole, wife, mother, novelist. For Epstein, it would be absolute authority on everything. No longer fit them in some sense, and they have, truly, in order to continue to live an authentic life, they both realize that they have to break those stories and expand them, and they have to leave behind those old forms. But of course, that's a quite terrifying thing to do. So it's sort of, this book is perched on that threshold, on that leap out into formlessness, in the hope of finding something, a story, a life that fits them better.
And Epstein, as you would call him, he's a man of affluence. He's tremendously rich, but he sort of lives a King Learian life now. He's giving away all his worldly goods. And in a way, when I read it, I thought, he's not so much lost in the world, in a forest, as finding an opening. Do you agree?
Well, I think that in a sense, the opening that he has found has to do with allowing himself a chance to be uncertain, to be silent, to be questioning. I mean, this is a man, if you all can imagine, a New York lawyer, extraordinarily successful in his life, a man who always captured the attention in any room he was in, always knew the answer to everything. And very late in life, I mean, really in the wake of his parents' deaths. And I think that's very significant because, of course, our parents are the ones who begin our narrative. And when they're gone, there's a crisis of that narrative. And so his parents both die, and he leaves his wife of many years. And there is this late, slow turning away from certainty toward a contemplation of the unknowable, away from materialism, so he begins to give everything away, and he becomes less and less and lighter and disappears. And there's this turning toward the spiritual. And of course, what happens when you allow yourself to turn, to not know everything for sure, is that you begin to be filled with wonder and with awe for all that is unknowable. And I think that is that moment where we meet him.
In a way, it's a happy story. There's this fantastic meeting in the beginning of the novel where he meets Abbas from the Palestinian administration or government, and everybody's talking, and people sort of take the stage, and he gets the microphone, and then suddenly he just doesn't say anything. And this is so unfamiliar with him.
Yeah.
And in a way, he's shocked himself.
He's shocked, but he's also enjoying just looking at everybody's face when he allows himself and the room this silence. That scene. It takes place in the Plaza Hotel, and it's this meeting between Abbas and his people from the Palestinian government and the kind of Jewish leadership of New York.
They cannot meet in Israel, but they can meet in New York.
Yeah, and I actually was at such a meeting.
You were?
Yes, I was, and I there was a long table in which we were all seated, and Abbas was there, and I happened to bring my mother with me. And somehow or other, most people there was a gathering of people who weren't sitting at the table, and somehow my mother who always manages to get what she wants, got a seat at a table somehow with all of these various, with Dershowitz on the side and as Abbas was coming out afterwards, he just gave her an enormous hug, and I thought, this has to be in a novel. This is too good. But it became something else. It became the story of Epstein and his lost coat, which is kind of where the story, the first thing that he loses, which begins this long tumble of actually giving things away.
He loses not only his coat, but his iPhone and his wallet and everything.
Everything, yeah.
Which is also kind of opening, because it opens up the world for him.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, if we move the scene to Tel Aviv,
Yeah.
Epstein, he ends up, he wants to go to Israel, he wants to do something in honor of his dead parents.
Yeah.
Whereas Nicole, she just feels she has to get away. She's really in a forest dark, in a way, because she has got what do you call that when you can't write anymore?
Well, you would say a writer's block.
That's it. I got that right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so for those who haven't read it, the book is kind of these two parallel stories of these characters are crossing and recrossing the same geographical ground. So they both start in New York, and then they move to Tel Aviv, specifically to the Tel Aviv Hilton Hotel. And from there, kind of the stories explode out into the desert. But I think, this for Epstein, it's a kind of normal passage. It's a very long sort of Jewish tradition of doing something in memory of your those who have passed, and so he goes to Israel to look for what that might be. And this rabbi who's kind of accosted him and told him, "Do you know that your name Epstein? It's one of the few names that goes all the way back to King David." And there are some of these names that apparently, according to some people, do, and that begins a whole fantasy in some sense in Epstein's mind about who he is and how he refers to the wonderful and huge life and story of King David.
This rabbi, he's called Klausner.
Yeah.
Did you choose that because Amos Oz was called Klausner?
No, it's something that only one person has ever asked me, but I can tell you that there's a wonderful coincidence that seems to happen with the choice of names, and I would say that there's only a part of our brains that is fully conscious about what we're doing when we make our choices generally in life, but specifically as novelists. And I told this story the other night, but in my second novel, I chose a name for the main character of Alma Singer, and she's 14, this young girl, and I just gave her the last name of the boyfriend that I had when I was 14, and I thought, that will do it, this works. And then later, everyone, like university, said to me, well, of course, Alma Singer was Isaac Bashevis Singer's wife, and that was a tribute to her, and I sort of secretly thought, no, it wasn't, that was just an accident, and Klausner and the relationship with Amos Oz, equally so, but I can't say that it's somehow part of my brain didn't know that and find it.
No, because I couldn't make it function either in the novel.
Yeah.
I don't see any Oz.
No, but I will tell you something about that rabbi, which, again, the way in which sort of we imagine things and then life surprises and confirms those things. When I was doing research for this novel, and I don't do much research, I'm not, I tend to like to imagine rather, but sometimes you do need some confirmation from reality. And so I went to Israel, largely to kind of figure out what had happened to Epstein, who I knew had disappeared in the desert, but I didn't know exactly what had happened. And along the way, I wanted to go to Sfat, which is where I knew he was going to go, under the guidance of this rabbi. And Sfat is a very spiritual place in the north of Israel, and it goes back really to the 16th century when a lot of mystical rabbis gathered there. And so I had this imagination of Klausner, this rabbi who is mystical but also manipulative, a kind of interesting mix of a man. And I had found someone, an old mayor of Svat, to take me around town. And he said, well, what are you looking for? And I said, I'll just know it when I see it. And suddenly, out of nowhere, from this tiny street, comes this rabbi, comes the character of my book, exactly as I described him, tall with the blue eyes, and this kind of casual, like sort of wheeling, dealing, but also authoritative, impressive style. And I said, who is that? And he said, oh, that's the rabbi, and he's brought this wedding from, the States. And I said, I'd like to talk to him, and he was perfect. And he gave, he sort of handed me wonderful material.
And you let them meet already on the plane.
Right. And so it happens that sometimes you imagine a character, and then that character comes out of life to meet you.
Yeah. Let's go back to Nicole, because she has this sensation that when she opens the door to her home, it feels as if she's already there.
Yeah.
And this doubleness that I'm already in this house, but I'm standing outside the door going in, and that sensation, it's very close to what an author does.
Yes, exactly. Right, well, in her case, it's a very literal sensation. She simply is sure that she is somewhere else in that house, upstairs, folding laundry, doing something else. And it's almost like a spell. And then the telephone rings and the moment passes. But she's no less convinced that it had happened somehow. And she goes back to tell the story of her earliest memory. And her earliest memory is of looking at a television show, and of a children's television show when she's like 2.5, and she sees in the studio audience herself. So, and she's absolutely sure, the girl turns and she sees in her eyes what it is to be her. And so her suggestion is, well, my entire life is built on this idea that I am here, but at the same time I am happening or living elsewhere. And either you could say this is something that is a unique pathology of the writer, because of course you're right, I'm here in my chair writing a book, but I am so many other places, and I become so many other lives, and necessarily in order to do that. And so our imaginations are always occupying that parallel universe that is art, that we also occupy as readers too. Or you could say, actually, but don't all of us to some degree have that sense of our other parallel life or lives that we could have lived, where we were going along and we happened to make a choice. We happened to turn left, and because we turned left, we met the person that we fell in love with and married, or we met something that changed our lives and our path forever. If we had gone right, it would have been a different story. And that turning right, the other person we might have met, the other life we might have lived, still is a shadow life. And the older we get, the more of those shadow other lives we kind of collect. I think everyone knows that experience well.
Especially when you are young, you fantasize a lot about that. I mean, I did it.
Yeah.
And reading is like that. But being an author also means some kind of loneliness, because you are at a distance from what you do. You have to be at a certain distance, and then look at yourself or all the people that you feel you're.
You mean you have to be at a distance from your life, or?
No, you have to have this capacity of a double eye, or seeing things from both sides, or
you have to be an actor and an observer.
Yeah, at the same time.
Yeah. I think that's true. But I think, I think this moving in and out of a solitude that allows us to really meditate on our lives and the world, and then being absolutely in the action of our lives. Again, I don't know that that's unique to writers. I think it's just how we live, and sometimes we find that less and less we're taking those moments of solitude and silence where we stand back and can really look at our lives, and we all miss that and need it more. And that's why we read, maybe, in part. Or that's why mindfulness has become such a craze now, because we're so hungry for that, which used to, I think, be something that was much more worked into life. I think in contemporary life, we've lost it, and we're trying to find it. But then also we like to be in the thick of action, and where we're not thinking. So we're moving in a kind of pendulum between those two states always.
Anyway, when Nicole in the novel comes to Tel Aviv, she also meets a person who takes her actually to a house where I have stood myself and watched.
Yeah.
The house of Broad's Franz Kafka. When he died, he wanted everything to be burnt, I suppose.
Yeah.
But his friend Max Brod, he took care of it all, and it ended up in a house in Tel Aviv.
Yeah, basically, like, as the Nazis were entering into Prague, Max Brod just filled the suitcase with all the remaining manuscripts of Kafka, almost none of which had been published at that point. And he made it out to what was then Palestine, and from there he began to publish Kafka's work. And then when he died in the 60s, his secretary inherited them, and then her daughters inherited them. So at the end of all that, it's basically there was a ground floor apartment in Tel Aviv on Spinoza Street where everyone knew, because there was a long court case about these papers, that
was resolved only the other day, I think.
Yeah, a while ago, but last year. But basically all of these papers were being held along with about 30 cats, and you could just stand outside and smell the stench of these cats, and your imagination would just go like, what is in there, and is it more Kafka, and and there's all these cages on the windows, so there was like this double layer of wire and bars, and you couldn't figure out whether you were being kept from getting into Kafka, or whether Kafka was being kept from coming out. But there was definitely a sense of claustrophobia and imprisonment. I think it was a real place, and it was part of my imagination. And in the novel, the character Nicole, and we should probably talk about why she's called Nicole at some point, but the character Nicole is brought there by a man. It's kind of like if Klausner is Epstein's Virgil, Friedman, this character is kind of Nicole's Virgil, her guide in Israel. And he may or may not have been former Mossad, or he may or may not have been a retired professor of literature at Tel Aviv University. We never really know. Nicole never knows. But he guides her to this house, and he basically says, you're a Jewish writer, you're writing for us, whether you want to or not. We have a project for you. And she's absolutely baffled by this, but it begins a journey that ends up in the desert for her, which takes her to a place she's never been before in herself, I would say.
Yes, I mean, it takes her into the desert, as also Epstein ends up in the desert. And this is not the first time you like deserts.
Yeah, it's true. I think you're referring to the first book, in which a character is found in the desert and he's lost his memory. I think, deserts are very, very powerful places to me, I feel. But I think, again, through time, they have been there. They are where people go for revelation. They are where people become lost and disoriented and are found or not found. And the Israeli desert, the Judean and the Negev are extremely rich historically, and so there are all kinds of reasons to send my characters there. And in a sense, not only Epstein and Nicole are sent there, Kafka is a kind of third ghostly character in the book. He's also a character who has his narrative renovated, we could say.
Yeah.
And there's also a story about him not dying in Prague in 1924, but actually escaping his overbearing father, escaping Europe, escaping the Holocaust, escaping his illness, and living out his life ultimately as a gardener, but also in the desert.
And of course, Nicole is a bit incredulous towards that. But at the same time, since she has this capacity of doubling, seeing herself as a double. She also can think that, why not? It could be possible.
Yeah, and apparently not only I, because there was a while in which there was like a really popular Google search that was, did Kafka die in 1924? So obviously there were a lot of people who read the novel and thought, did I get it right? Did he actually die, or is there some other story? And what was fascinating to me when I was writing this book is that idea of Kafka not dying came to me in the desert. So I told you I took this trip, or I did some quote-unquote research that was largely unproductive except for these odd moments. And at some point I was out in the middle of in the Judean, and I was staying at a Bedouin tent, and these Israeli Bedouin tents that are like never owned by Bedouins. And this owner of this place had kept me up like half the night telling me the story of his 24 reincarnations. This is Israel. And then I went to bed and I thought, oh God, I'm really getting nowhere with what happened to Epstein. And I had this kerosene lantern that I turned on, and I took out my dusty computer and I thought, where am I in all of this? And then just suddenly this idea came to me, like, wait a minute, Kafka didn't die in 1924 in Prague. Like, he came here. And I couldn't explain why I knew that it was absolutely right. And it was only when I went home to New York and I started to reread all of the diaries and the letters, and I began to really understand how much of a fantasy it really was for Kafka to escape to Palestine, how serious he was about learning Hebrew, which he studied for like 10 years. He was able to write in Hebrew. He had these fantasies where he and his girlfriend would own a cafe in Tel Aviv, and he would be the waiter and she would be the cook. And he really imagined himself there, and on so many levels it made sense as this escape that nobody would know about, that could be planned by his friends. So I found the evidence for it after I had the epiphany that it had to be.
On the other hand, Kafka had a lot of fantasies.
Kafka did have a lot of fantasies, but most of them were about women he knew that he ultimately couldn't have or didn't want or couldn't sustain. I think the Palestine fantasy was unique in a sense that he didn't imagine himself in lots of other places, but he did imagine himself there. And it makes sense because he was very heavily steeped in Midrash and in biblical stories. And at that time, Israel as a state didn't exist. It was still an idea. And Kafka always said, I don't feel like I was made for this world, that he really felt like he didn't exist in this world, he existed in literature. And at that point, Palestine was still an idea of literature in the Bible, or an idea that was still to come. So it sort of it's a more proper home for him, at least in his mind it was, than any real place.
Yeah, I think you're very right there. And this is not only true for Jewish writers, it's really true for Christian writers too, that they knew more about Jerusalem and Nazareth than about their own hometown, often because they'd heard everything in chapel or church and so on. But talking about Jewish literature, you quote in the book Kafka when he said, people ask me what I have in common with Jewish culture or Jews. I don't even know what I have in common with myself, or something like that.
Yeah.
And there has always been a discussion about how Jewish is Kafka. Does he really write as a Jewish writer? And you really, or you let Nicole experience in the book what it means to have that kind of pressure on you, to sort of write for a whole people.
Yes.
There is this fantastic scene when Nicole goes and buys some groceries, and a woman sort of attacks her about what she has to do for Jewish literature.
Yeah. And when she raises her arms, Nicole sees the tattooed number. So it's not just the expectation, but it's also the guilt of what you are supposed to do. And but I think, I mean, just to start with the Kafka argument, to me it's largely irrelevant. I just don't really have any, I don't have a great deal of interest in that argument. Kafka is a writer for himself and for everyone, and his books were a gift, and we will do what we will do with them. And it doesn't matter whether, they're Jewish or not Jewish. There's so many things, and I feel in the question of Kafka, that question became very fierce in the battle over his papers, because it really became about ownership. And ownership, again, is just not something that I think you can apply to art. It doesn't belong to anyone, and it belongs to everyone. And everyone should be able to read those papers, and it doesn't matter where they are, as long as they're open to everyone. You know?
I totally agree with you,
Yeah.
but I only recently had a seminar about Bruno Schulz.
Yeah,
People asked me the same thing. Was he really a Jewish writer?
yeah.
Well, he wanted to be a writer for the world, of course.
Yes, and I think then that's a good segue to my feeling about it, which is that it's just not something that I think, I don't, and I think the position I hold might be of one of wanting it both ways, but I think it's okay. And those wanting it both ways is, I feel extremely lucky to have been born into such a rich tradition, intellectual, cultural, artistic, psychological, emotional. There's so much material, like thousands of years of good material, you know, and I know that as a writer, that's an enormous gift. And yet at the same time, I don't feel I want to represent anyone or be beholden to representation, because the moment I do that, I agree to give up my freedom. And the moment I agree to give up even the smallest bit of my freedom, I'm not going to be as honest a writer, and then the whole project is not worthwhile. My independence and my freedom is paramount to my being able to do anything worthwhile.
Which doesn't prevent you from investing a lot in Jewish themes. If you look at your novels.
That's what I mean. I think the
Yeah.
material is wonderful,
Yeah.
and I think, and I use it as I'm inspired to use it. So this book has some, wonderful ideas from Jewish mysticism that get woven into the story and become central to it. It has, like for example, the story of David that I was referencing. It gave me a kind of like a vertebra for designing Epstein, because David is such a fascinating. He's the first great character, the human character in the Bible, because he was so conflicted. And here you have this manipulative, brutal, absolutely authoritative man, but also
Adulterer.
but beloved,
Yeah.
completely beloved, and the author of some of the most beautiful poetry ever written, the Psalms. So he has this poetic side, and I think it's that side that Epstein realizes he's in his namesake or in his progenitor, he has been lacking, and so he turns toward it. So there are wonderful ways to use all of that material as a writer, but it doesn't mean that my, sort of my object is to represent any one in particular, only this unique standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Being in the novel, when it is in Israel, it's a very Jewish world. Epstein and Nicole hardly meet anybody else but Jewish people, and they're in Tel Aviv, of course.
Mm.
And yesterday I heard you say, or it was yesterday, I think, I heard you say that you don't think Tel Aviv is such an Israeli town. It's a town built in an Arab culture.
Yeah.
But at the same time, from my experience from being in Tel Aviv a lot, correct me if I'm wrong, Tel Aviv has its face turned towards Europe all the time.
I don't think it does anymore. I think that was what I was trying to say yesterday, is that not only Tel Aviv, but all of Israel had its face turned toward Europe and then increasingly America for a very, very long time. But something in the last years has changed monumentally there. And it's changed on a number of levels. Suddenly culture, whether it's food or whether it's the music that everyone is listening to, or whether it is art, anything, it is design. It is all coming from the influence of the Arabic world. There's a recognition of being a city that it is in that context, in the Middle Eastern context, let's say. And I think that it's significant that it's only now, Israel has only existed for 70 years. The language which was brought back from the dead, right, has only now, I think, become so sophisticated that Israel, nobody else can tell the story of Israel except Israelis in their own language. And as they do it, they are turning away from America and turning away from Europe. And I think that mystifies the people in the diaspora very much. But it is inevitable in a large way. I don't know when you were there last, but maybe it's
last year.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe as a European, I don't know if you've traveled widely in the Middle East, but it certainly still feels different than other places in the Middle East. But more and more, I just think all the music on every taxi driver's radio is Arabic, and all the food is.
That's true.
Yeah.
But then the Hilton Hotel still stands as a horrendous building. It could be some apartment building from the GDR or something.
Yeah, I was saying that the other night at an event in Stockholm, and an architect came up in the line and said, I actually think it's a brilliant building. So I guess there are those who disagree. I don't know if anyone actually knows what this building looks like that we're talking about, but it's on the cover of the book, but very small there. It was built in the late 60s, and it was built in the brutalist style. So it is a concrete block, and it's an absolutely perfect concrete grid. And it's built perpendicular to the shoreline, and you see it's so large that you see it always from the airplane when you fly into Tel Aviv. And it's just one of those buildings. I've spent a lot of time there because I grew up going there. My parents got married at that hotel, and it's a building that seems to take its right as architecture, that right being to design how we move through space, right? Architecture and designs for us how we are moving through any given space. It takes that right to in a kind of domineering way. It seems to be you can only move in right angles or exist. And yet, in the novel, it becomes, at least in Nicole's imagination and her memory, in some sense the opposite. Not this rigid, enforcing, closed place that insists on a certain reality, but actually, because quite magical things happen to her there, it becomes this portal that allows her to almost imagine other worlds, other realities. And the notion of other realities, or is this reality the only one, is definitely a significant part of Forest Art.
Exactly, and they both end up in the Hilton, or at some time they both are in the Hilton without ever seeing each other, Epstein and Nicole. But to her, it has got something magic about it. She was conceived there, so was he. But she's a writer, so she fantasizes.
Yeah. Epstein is conceived in Tel Aviv, and he goes back to Tel Aviv because of that to a degree. But yeah, there's something in her imagination about it as her source. And there's this point early on in the book where she sort of imagines, is there some place from which all of us are kind of, she's listening to this long radio show about the multiverse, and she goes into all kinds of ideas about worlds and other worlds, and then she says, is it possible that we're all dreaming our lives from one place, but maybe a really banal place? And if so, then she thinks she's dreaming her life from that Hilton Hotel. So in a sense, she does kind of go back to the beginning to kind of find out where the other path of her life might take her.
I think there's a wonderful, not contradiction, but on the one hand you have the Hilton with all its rooms and all that can happen in a hotel. And on the other hand, when Nicole finally ends up in the desert, she's all alone in a shed with a dog and almost no food. And since the dog is so hungry, she rather would feed the dog than herself. And there's a wonderful sense of saying that this having a totally clean plate, or no pun implied, since there was no food, but having that and the nothingness is reviving her in a way. She gets very sick, but finally she can sort of change her life. And change is very important in this book.
Yeah.
And I mean, Kafka's Die Verwandlung, whatever it's called in English.
Are you talking about Metamorphosis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that in Hebrew, it's Gil.
Yeah, this is a beautiful idea. So in the what we call the metamorphosis, what do you call it?
Die Verwandlingen.
And is that a title about changing shape, about metamorph, like all the?
Gregor Samsa, who turns into.
But the word that you have in your as your title, does it mean changing shape?
Yes,
okay.
It can mean
changing. Okay, shape. So in English it's called metamorphosis, but in the Hebrew and the Yiddish translation of that story, so in a sense, in the Jewish imagining of that story, it's called Hagilgul or Der Gilgul, and Gilgul means it means a cycle. So you have this cycle or a wheel, but it also, in mystical terms, it means the transmigration of the soul. So this is a beautiful idea that actually this is not about a transformation of a physical transformation of a man into an insect, but it's about a transformation of the soul. And in some sense, it's a beautiful reading because, you know, this word vermin that we call it vermin, I don't know how they use it in Swedish, but it's the word that Kafka's father used to call his Jewish friends. So when Gregor Samsa turns into a vermin, there's also a reading of him turning into a Jew in some sense, and so this finding, this transformation of the soul. So there's so many wonderful things that can be done in translation, in a way. And
Klausner's project, the Rabbi's project, has the same name. So there are parallels all the time between the two worlds.
Yeah, but I think, you know, just to return to the idea that I think you were starting with about change and about transformation, I think that it has always been to me the kind of the gift that art offers us, that literature offers us, this opportunity to be transformed. And I think on some level, we as readers, it's what we hope for when we open a book. We kind of wouldn't admit that we're that hopeful, but we really actually want to be transformed in some way and believe that we can. I mentioned this line last night from Rilke's poem, which is the poem is called The Archaic Bust of Apollo, but the last line is, "You must change your life." And I always think of that as the imperative of literature, that this notion that we must change. And of course, we are the only species that is aware of the fact that we must evolve to survive, and that change is necessary, as hard as it is.
And I think the line before that last line is even more interesting when it comes to art, because it says, "There is no place there in this torso of Apollo that doesn't see you." That's why you have to change, because art sees you.
That, in other words, that you have been seen out, and you have to change towards your more authentic self, maybe. Yeah.
I think we're going towards the end. We have another minute.
Okay.
What should we use that minute for? Say that I think this is a wonderful book where you sort of get two parallel lives, and both in their different ways sort of are fine with the fact that they cannot at all be sure about anything.
Yeah.
So this uncertainty, to sort of say yes to ambiguity and uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that's also when it comes to writing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that it's something that I learned as a writer, that, I mean, in a sense, I have no choice when I'm writing a novel but to sustain a certain amount of uncertainty for years until I've lived with the questions of the novel for long enough. And at some point or other, I realized that was not only the way I wanted to write, but it was also, for me, the way to live. That it moves us towards a more authentic, richer life. But it's certainly not easy.
Thank you so much. And I must tell everybody that Nicole Krauss will be here and sign the book outside, I think.
I think so.
Somewhere up there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.